Hello, and welcome back to the IA Talks AI, the Investment Association's podcast series that explores everything to do with AI in the investment management industry. My name is James King, and I'm delighted to once again be your host. We're extremely lucky today because we have not one, not two, but three guests here to discuss AI today. We have Dr. Florian Ostman from the Alan Turing Institute. We have Sandeep Bandari from the National Physical Laboratory, and we have Matilda Rode from the British Standards Institute. And together, these three organisations make up the AI Standards Hub. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Maybe we could start with some quick introductions. If I could ask you each in turn just to say who you are and what your role is at your respective organisations. Dr. Florian?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to be here. So my role within the Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for AI, is to lead a team that's focused on AI governance and regulatory innovation. That involves a combination of research and advisory work. We do a lot of work with regulators and government to think about the implications of AI from a regulatory and governance perspective. Some of that work is cross-cutting, sort of adopting a cross-sectoral perspective, but we've also done work specifically focused on financial services, for example, as a sector. Most significantly, we wrote a report on the implications of AI in financial services that was commissioned by the FCA. That was published a couple of years ago. And in addition to that more regulation-focused work, our team is delivering the Turing side of the work on the AI Standards Hub.
Thank you. Matilda?
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's great to be here. So I'm Matilda. I work at BSI, which is the UK national standards body. So our organisation convenes groups of experts who write standards, and my role there is the sector lead for AI and cybersecurity. So I spend a lot of time talking with companies, consumer groups about how standards are serving their needs and how they could serve them better. And yet we're part of the AI Standards Hub, which has got several missions, and one of those is, really promoting and socialising the fact that these standards exist, which is very important, from our perspective.
Excellent. And last but not least, Sandeep.
Hi, thanks, James. My name's Sunny. So I'm from the National Physical Laboratory, which is the UK's National Measurement Institute or Metrology Institute, but metrology is not the weather. So what we do is we have custodians of the highest points of reference for things like the time, the amp, the kilogram, and the second, and keep those for the UK and disseminate them across the UK such that others can benefit from those. My role there is the Chief Digital Innovation Officer. So I've talked about amps and kilograms, but what does that mean in a world where we're driven by data at the speed of AI? So where are those traceable points of reference for the quality of data before we even get to the AI? But then how do we measure things like the trustworthiness, the assurance, and the safety of AI?
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much again for being with us. We have lots of very important questions to tackle, but maybe it's worth us starting with a bit of a baseline. So when we talk about standards in this context, what exactly are we talking about?
So standards in their most basic sense, an agreed way of doing something. And that could be an agreed way of running a practice within an organisation, so around ways that we do governance and management, or it might be specific controls or the way we implement something, which could be network interface or even the safe height for a step in a standard building. Really cover anything from kind of bouncy castles to AI, so they're quite wide-ranging.
Excellent. And the AI Standards Hub, how did that come about? And, what were some of the decisions around who ultimately was involved, and why exactly was it set up in the first place?
So the AI Standards Hub was launched about 1.5 years ago, and born out of a recognition that within the AI space, the kinds of standards that Matilda just described are set to play a really important role, both as a governance tool to ensure that AI is used and developed responsibly, but also as a way of accelerating adoption and sort of spreading knowledge about AI. So the recognition that standards are really important and the need to raise awareness for them, but also a recognition that not all stakeholders in the AI ecosystem are necessarily aware of the role of standards, especially if you think about startups playing a really important role, in driving AI innovation. As a startup founder, standardization may not be sort of top of your mind. In fact, you may never have thought of standards before. Similarly, a recognition of the fact that it's really important that non-industry stakeholders are involved in the development of standards, so civil society, regulators, academic researchers. And so the mission really is to raise awareness for standards and ensure that all relevant stakeholder groups are empowered to play an active role in the AI standard space.
Yeah, and if you look around the world, every single country at the moment has some kind of set of priority emerging technology areas that they're looking at. And the UK is no different from that. So in the UK, we have our top 5 technologies, of which AI is one. Countries around the world have the same list of priorities. So there is a global race going on here, but actually without working together internationally, it would be quite a challenge. But counter to that is if I start up my own AI company tomorrow morning, do I have time to engage with standards? Do I even understand what standards are? So there's a whole piece of education as well as bringing society and our innovators on this journey with us, such that the UK can benefit and the global society can benefit from standards as well.
And Florian, if I could ask you a bit more about the AI Standards Hub's mission and the pillars that hold up that mission and how you're looking to deliver on that mission.
Yeah, thank you. So as you just suggested, our priorities are distributed across 4 pillars that we have defined for the AI Standards Hub's mission. The first of those pillars is what we refer to as the observatory pillar. That's a function that's mainly to be found on our website, on aistandardshub.org, where we have databases for standards, so a database that tracks AI standards under development and standards that have been published, and then also a database for AI-related policy documents, such as regulatory guidance that's emerging around the world, and so on. And so the purpose of that pillar is to help stakeholders get the information they need in a single place to make sense of the standards landscape for AI. The second pillar is around community and collaboration. So this is where the hub hosts different types of events to bring stakeholders together, think about challenges, think about what kinds of standards may be needed, and how collaboration may help advance progress in this space. The third pillar is capacity building, knowledge and training. So our priority there is to equip stakeholders with the knowledge they need to make a meaningful contribution in the standard space. So that might be knowledge about how does standardization work, what are the most important organizations, how do I get involved, but also knowledge about best practice. So if I happen to be in a committee to draft a standard about bias mitigation, what does best practice look like? So I can make a contribution to that standard. And then lastly, the fourth pillar is around research and analysis, where we carry out a range of different research projects to help give a strategic direction to the standard space, also inform the relationship between AI standards and AI regulation, both domestically and internationally.
The partnership consists of 3 of the UK's national bodies involved in the UK's national quality infrastructure. I'll explain a bit more about what that infrastructure looks like in a moment, but we comprise the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI, so really deep as well as broad expertise in data sciences and artificial intelligence, be it in foundational science all the way through to sector-specific and application work. And then we've got the UK's national standards body, which leads on all standards development in the UK, and actually also sometimes leads the international standards effort. So there's several standards that are UK-led on the international scene. And then last but not least is the organisation that I represent, which is the UK's National Metrology Institute, which is all about the technical measurement standards that underpin everything from blue sky academic research through to large international entrepreneurship. So it's quite a good combination that then gives us as a group that breadth and depth where skills that we have complement each other. And that hopefully gives UK PLC the biggest bang for buck that it can get from this partnership. And of course, we're all driven by the national purpose rather than our own specific missions. So really focused on getting that impact for the UK taxpayer. Quality infrastructure that I mentioned sits within the UK, and every country tends to have its own quality infrastructure. Within the UK, it's comprised of the National Measurement Institute, the National Standards Body, then the Office for Product Safety and Specification, i.e. the people who do the legal measurement and go out and check that you're doing what you should be doing, and then the UK Accreditation Service. So generally around the world, you'll see similar organisations which take work from their academic community as well as some of the industrial research areas and help develop these standards. And I'm speaking specifically about digital technical standards here, not other types of standards, because as Matilda said earlier, there are lots of different standards for different things. And so by working together as making that whole greater than some of its parts, we're also hoping to show additional value for the UK taxpayer.
And if you don't mind me asking, how can you even approach writing standards for a topic like AI when it's moving so quickly?
That's a great question, and one we hear quite regularly, because the landscape, particularly in kind of the public recognition and business appetite to adopt AI technologies, has really boomed in the last few years. The international standards development effort in AI has been in place for many years preceding that, and that EU AI Act was long being planned, and its publication has kind of coincided with the explosion of interest in the subject as well. But I'd say that standards are very aware of their own timelines and the time that it takes to develop them. And there is a balance to be struck between writing down what good practice looks like and waiting for good practice to emerge in a space. And that's one of the key reasons why we have the Standards Hub, where we're working together, trying to have a slightly more agile approach to development, where we're closely tied in to what we can do in terms of measurement and what academic research sees on the horizon, to have the front foot on that. And we have a few kind of more rapid standards development, agile standards development mechanisms that we've developed within BSI, and other national standards bodies have kind of equivalents as well.
It'd be really good to understand a bit more about your priorities for 2024. What is it you're looking to push forward this year?
So one important priority of our work recently has been to think about international collaboration. The AI Standards Hub was an initiative that was launched in the UK. We were funded by the UK government, and obviously the organizations behind the hub, 3 key UK national organizations: the National Institute for AI, the National Standards Body, and the National Measurement Institute. And over the last 12 months or so for initial operation, we had a lot of interest in the hub's work from around the world. Recognition that other jurisdictions are recognizing similar needs and challenges around raising awareness, building capacity around AI standardization. And so we've been thinking quite hard about what we can do to build on the work we've done in the UK to collaborate internationally with key partners in other jurisdictions to address those challenges jointly and collaboratively.
And some of the other topics that we're really focused on going forward is around widening participation in standards making. So taking part in developing standards has resource requirements on individuals, but AI technology, I think, is a key theme from last year when we had the AI Safety Summit hosted in the UK, and a lot of public discussion about AI technology, which persists into this year. We're interested in how we can look at bringing in a wider number of voices into the standards development process, including, members of the public and small companies as well, who might not have the resources to engage, but we think we should, enable them to be heard in the process as well.
Yeah, so I think one of the big things at the moment, and the phrase or the word is everywhere, which is the thing about AI safety. So I think there's a lot of work that will need to be done on that before we actually get near to the standards, because there's a whole host of work, and for something as simple as agreeing what taxonomies and terminologies we use, because in the UK we may use bias to mean one thing. In other countries they may they may use it to mean something different. So as long as we understand what others are, we need to have this agreed taxonomy and set of definitions before we then move on to do some of the technical work. So what I can see happening as a big priority this year is bringing together a coalition of the willing that really do want to start inputting and working together on some of this work. There's a lot of work needed pre-standardization, such that when you've got the standards, you can then measure what it says on the tin, so to speak, at the end of that. So I think there's going to be a lot more work in international collaboration. I think also this year you'll start to see the safety standards and the risk management standards, or the AI assurance standards, for sector-specific work. So you may see things happening in the finance sector. You'll see things happening in HR, autonomous vehicles. So I think you'll see sector-specific standards development, but then a global focus on the fundamentals.
Maybe just to build on that, Sunny's point around sector-specific work. So I think over the last year or so, our initial focus has been on what we would generally refer to as horizontal standards. Most standards that are currently being developed for AI in organizations such as ISO are designed to apply to all kinds of AI systems across different sectors, across use cases. But it's very clear that there will be a need for standards that address sector-specific and use case-specific needs. And one of the big challenges and questions, also as a research question in this space, is to figure out what are the gaps, what's the relationship between horizontal standards and sector-specific standards. And it's a particularly interesting question in the financial services sector, I think, given that it's a highly regulated sector. There are a lot of pre-existing frameworks and rules. There are also lots of fora that aren't standards development organizations that tend to set rules. And so there's quite a complex set of questions around what role will the kinds of standards that we're looking at play in the financial services sector, and what support can they provide to fill gaps that exist in the sector.
So I was going to come in and say something similar. So just to build on what Florian's just said, is as part of the Standards Hub's first pieces of work is we convened about 7 or 8 different stakeholders groups, which included people like large multinationals, startups, academics, and relevant to what I'm thinking right now is the regulatory groups. So people like the DCR, DRCF, people like the FCA, and the medical devices agencies. And so what we've seen from that is that some of those regulatory bodies are quite far ahead. Financial services is a great example where AI has been used for decades almost now. It's been really used and becoming more and more prominent for a number of reasons and for a number of applications. So we can see a lot of work happening in those areas, and we think that's where we'll probably get a lot of things charging ahead. The UK government also prioritised these regulatory AI sandboxes. So I can see downstream that the Standards Hub will be working alongside the regulators and then all the technical people associated to that to really drive things forwards in that space.
It's very interesting stuff because, of course, in February of this year, 2024, the government responded to its AI white paper from last year, and they largely confirmed they're going to go ahead with the approach as they laid out. So we have the 5 high-level principles and then essentially delegate to the sector regulators to make specific rules within their domains. And something that, many people have picked up on is that a potential drawback to such an approach is you now have multiple regulators somewhat independently, simultaneously regulating AI. And for organizations who need to grapple with regulation, that potentially may lead to some complexity and challenges. So do you see a key role for standards here to bring greater coherence to the UK's current and future approach to AI regulation?
Yeah, I think standards play an interesting role in interfacing between different regulatory regimes. And we often think about that between different countries because companies are operating internationally. But as you mentioned, it could also facilitate a standardized way of operating between different regulatory principles. Sunny mentioned the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum, and a really interesting point I heard from one of the regulators who's part of that. They said, some of the ethical principles around AI in practice mean different things when they're implemented in different sectors. So in finance, you might be considered discriminating against somebody if you over-personalized your AI to them to give them a price, for example. But in healthcare, you might be considered to be discriminating against someone because you're under-personalized to them, so they're not getting the same level of service. And I think that's looping back to the idea around, the kind of sector priorities as well. And I think we will start to see more sector-specific standards and doing that interpretation piece. There's already been a standard on use of AI in healthcare, for example, and I think we might see others follow suit. And we're working closely with regulators in the UK to understand their position and where they want to kind of take their mandate to be leaders in the space.
I think so. So I agree with that it could get quite complex quite quickly, if not already. But there is something in here about context. So it's often said that AI is quite context specific. So what might matter to me might not matter to me in 5 minutes, or indeed might not matter to you right now. Yeah, it could be a critical thing for me from a business or a safety perspective. So there's that element for us to be thinking about. But then also things like interoperability. So if we took, for example, a finance application, maybe insurance is a good example because there's always medical insurance at play. So where do the regulations from a medical perspective overlap with those financial service regulations? So there is a piece of understanding there. So what I'm really trying to say is there'll be a set of horizontal standards that will apply to most things. But then we will be looking at that interoperability piece as things start to diverge or have different focus areas. So very complex landscape. And our role is has a part to play in that, not necessarily the role of figuring out how we make the complex simple.
As a note on this point around complexity, so we have a database for AI standards that we developed on the website for the AI Standards Hub. And that currently contains over 250 standards that either already published or under development that are related to AI. Now, that's quite a large number. And part of our mission, of course, is to help stakeholders navigate that space and understand what are standards that are relevant to their context. And going to your question, part of the work we've been doing is to work with regulators to help them navigate that space, especially given that, as you will probably know, the AI white paper and also the consultation response actively encourages regulators to look at standards as a source of knowledge to shape their guidance around the 5 principles. And so standards, as Matilda mentioned, can be a really valuable source, a really valuable tool, but you need to figure out which standards to use. And sort of you look at the 5 principles, you look at 250 plus standards. And it's not as simple as just looking at the title of the standard. You really need to dive deeper into the content of the standards to see to what extent they touch on different principles. And so that's some of the more research-oriented work that we're trying to do to support with navigating that space.
So just to build a little bit on top of that, so if we looked at those 5 overarching principles, the bit that NPL is very interested in from a technical measurement standard perspective is how do I measure for example, the safety, security, and robustness, because that's one of those 5 principles. And why is that, or how is that different from, say, the medical environment to the financial services through to the work that Ofgem does, for example? So there'll be different ways to think about things, different ways to measure stuff, which then feeds into the other types of standards and the ability for us to then check for compliance, to accredit different services, products, applications. So it's quite a lot of work. The one thing I will say is that people like NPL, people like BSI, people like Turing, we don't do things in isolation. NPL is part of 100 nation-state organizations around the world that have to agree on what, for example, an amp is, what a kilogram is. Again, coming back to part of my introduction is how do we even start on that work for data and AI?
Maybe we could dive into that a little bit more, the international aspect. So you've mentioned it, and of course, many jurisdictions around the globe are currently grappling with the question of how to effectively regulate AI from the perspective of many organizations, such as investment association members, they're global companies, and as far as possible, they want to try and have a, overarching approach that they can take internationally when it comes to AI. So it would be good to understand a bit more about the role of standards in helping to drive greater international alignment or at least coherence when it comes to AI regulation globally.
So standards can play a really key role in achieving international alignment or regulatory interoperability, as some might say. And Matilda already commented on some of those aspects. I think one thing that's been really interesting over the last couple of years, looking at regulatory developments around the world, is that you see, on the face of it, regulatory approaches that differ in terms of their approach and the angle they take. So, for example, there's often a contrast being drawn between the EU AI Act as an approach and the UK government's approach to AI regulation. And of course, we've seen recent developments in the US and many other jurisdictions. What's been interesting to see, although it's not too surprising if you think about the history of standards, is that despite those differences in the regulatory approach, there is a really strong common theme emerging across jurisdictions in that they all emphasize the role of standards. So in the context of the EU AI Act, for example, now the AI Act is passed, there's a lot of attention around what are referred to as the harmonized standards that are developed by CEN-CENELEC at the European level that will support the implementation of the AI Act. The more recent statement in the US around the executive order places strong emphasis on standards, especially international standards. And then, of course, the UK's approach emphasizes the role of international standards. And so we really see, I think, and we'll increasingly see sort of a convergence around, work across jurisdictions on standards. And then, of course, thinking about to what extent can those standards be international standards that enable alignment despite sort of differences in what the law might say?
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Florian said, I think it is interesting to observe that pattern of pointing to international standards. And I don't think it's just because governments are thinking about making it easy for companies. I think it's also because it touches so many different technical, ethical, it gets really deep into the socio-technical space as well. And actually specifying the implementation of things which are required in law, it allows those governments to kind of delegate to the groups of experts that write the standards as well. So it's kind of interesting to observe it in the space, yeah.
So one of the things that standards enables is for people to trade around the world. An example I often cite is if we have UK standards for autonomous vehicles, what happens when I get on that ferry or that Eurotunnel and land in France? What does that mean for my operating system? Now, obviously, if I'm buying a car from whichever manufacturer, they're not going to sell me a car, or I won't purchase a car that's only valid for driving in the UK because I want to go over to Europe. So using that as an example, you can see that these standards will enable trade in the future. I can foresee them becoming parts of digital trade agreements, being quite a key enabler for these things. And for that to happen, people do need to agree on things. We do need to come back to what do we mean by safe? What do we mean by AI assurance? What do we mean by risk management? If we think about the financial services industry, it's truly global. So how do we interoperate? How do we trade between the big financial centers around the world? How do we ensure that a trade taking place one where is valid and accepted in another jurisdiction? So all of these will fold into some form of standards in the future, and we'll need them to enable that trade to happen.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, all of you, Florian, Sunny, and Matilda. We really appreciate you taking your time to come and speak to us today. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Do keep coming back. We have more episodes on the way. Thank you.